All right. Thank you so much, Kevin. Yeah, so welcome everybody. This is a talk that I'm excited to give. It is one that I will admit is one of the more difficult ones to put together because it's just there's so much data, so much information out there, and trying to make sense of it has been a challenge. But I really hope to kind of go through this and spend the next hour talking to you all about oak regeneration and particularly a lot of the science around it that's happened over the last couple decades. So, kind of how I went about this really was I reviewed about 50 of the recent research articles or theses or dissertations uh, based on research here on oak regeneration in the eastern United States. And then I summarized these relevant findings into different categories, all with an attempt to craft a cohesive narrative, I guess you would call it, that really puts the results of this research kind of into a context of understanding what are landowners and foresters' management options and some of the decisions you have to make when you're looking to try to uh, build up and develop oak regeneration in your forest. I'm going to turn my video off now so you have you see the whole screen, and I'll turn it back on at the questions. So I hope to leave plenty times for questions. And just kind of some of the take-home messages after really looking through all this research over the last few weeks is there's a lot of varying results. There's not a silver bullet that you can do to guarantee that you're going to get oak regeneration. Every situation out there, everybody's forest is unique. It has different drivers that are influencing oak regeneration, and there may be different practices needed depending on the situation. In general, obtaining oak regeneration is a lot easier on sites that have lower productivity, so less fertile soils. Once you get into those highly productive sites where the trees really grow well, that's where you look at requiring a lot more intervention to try to get oak regeneration. Best approaches that I've found, and we'll talk about this in detail, but are really combination of practices, especially on those really productive sites. You're going to look at multiple types of disturbances and introducing them at the same time or in sequence in your forest. All right. So what I'm going to do today really is give a general, really quick overview of oak ecology, particularly the conditions that oaks have, the ecology, the biology of them that led to oak overstory dominance in today's forest, some on the ground things, and then get into the factors that we see that are influencing oak regeneration, and then take a specific look at this kind of regeneration bottleneck where we're looking at this advanced regeneration is really lacking on the landscape. And then really the heart of the talk is going to be looking at research around practices that are used to promote oak regeneration, specifically thinning, prescribed fire, and overstory removal. And I'll talk about a few others as well, and then try to finish up with putting it all together into some take-home messages again. All right. So let's just start a little bit with some primer on oak ecology. This may be review for a lot of you all, but it's always good to cover it. So oaks in general fall into that group, what we call having intermediate shade tolerance. So they aren't the most shade tolerant. There's certainly a lot of trees that are more shade tolerant than them, but then there's a lot of trees that are fast growing trees that do best in full sunlight, right? So oaks kind of fall into that middle ground. It's often said they need somewhere around 65% canopy or so to really thrive. That number certainly varies a whole lot, but do know that they do like it, this kind of intermediate level of sun. And so we see oaks thriving in kind of more open forests. They do well in sites where there's kind of naturally a lot of light. And so we're looking at poor soils, sites that may not have the same growing potential for a lot of the other trees. Oaks tend to really thrive well in there. Often also happen to be very fire tolerant, and that's kind of fire tolerant in two different ways. One is they tend to have thick bark that resists damage from fire at a smaller size than a lot of other trees, but also they just tend to be able to sprout really well. Oaks tend to allocate a lot of energy into their roots early in their life, and so damage to the top, even a fire that'll top kill that plant, oaks just are able to sprout and keep growing from that. And we see that whether that's fire, grazing, harvest, anything that know that oaks tend to be very, very good at sprouting. And we even see that with older trees in some forest where this forest may have been logged in the past or may have been grazed heavily, and you can see that there's just evidence of former sprouting. And so really, from all these conditions, oaks being able to grow in harsh conditions, being able to withstand fire, being able to sprout, where we see oaks on the landscape would be as often as the dominant tree species in dry forest, kind of harsh conditions where it's not as the greatest growing conditions or low productivity sites, or they're dominant in sites that have a lot of natural disturbances. So edge of prairies, savannas, open woodlands, these areas, this kind of disturbance maintained tree is kind of what we call oaks. A lot of times. So they do best in those situations. And again, they're often the dominant tree species. And we also see oaks as a component of more productive forest. Sometimes they're the dominant tree in those productive forests. Sometimes they're a lesser component, but they also can grow in there as well. So we see them kind of across the landscape in our upland forest. I'm not talking as much about the lowland oaks today. And historically, there was a lot of natural disturbances that helped facilitate oaks maintaining these positions of dominance on the landscape, whether that's flooding in lower areas, natural and anthropogenic fire throughout the last 10 to 12,000 years, drought situations, diseases, wind storms, ice storms. All of these are disturbances on the landscape, and oaks do best with disturbance. That helps them um, maintain a dominance level. It helps them stay in the canopy because they are one of the tougher trees we have and have the ability really to withstand a lot of these disturbances. So that's kind of where we're at with oaks, right? We are a landscape that's naturally had a lot of disturbances, as well as anthropogenic fire and other disturbances. People have been managing oaks for 10 to 12,000 years on the landscape. So things kind of changed a little bit with European settlement. And so this happened, when this happened, we saw some big changes. Specifically, we actually saw an increase in fire frequency initially. So when the Europeans came in, they were using fire for clearing the woods, for other types of management out there. And so we saw this increase in how often fires on the landscape, and then followed that with an actual big reduction in fire frequency later. But initially, we saw more fire. We saw cattle grazing the woods, large scale land clearing and heavy logging initially. Basically, there was a really high demand for wood as a fuel source, a construction resource. And so most of the woods here in Illinois were cleared or heavily logged. And at the same time, we saw this loss or great reduction in acorn predators, some of the major acorn predators on the landscape. Wild turkey and white-tailed deer both were basically extirpated out of Illinois. Their populations went down to very close to zero. Passenger pigeons was certainly fed on a lot of acorns. Obviously, as everybody knows, kind of was driven to extinction. And so all these major acorn predators, so we saw a loss in those. And then all of that kind of then followed with this kind of large scale land abandonment or a shift back to forest. So somewhere around the 1920s to 1940s, we saw a lot of land that had been cleared, had been heavily logged, kind of allowed to go back to forest. And so, with several decades of this kind of real harsh, heavy use of fire, grazing, land clearing, heavy logging, all the loss of acorn predators, we actually saw an increase in oak dominance. So they probably have more oaks. Oaks were probably a higher prevalence in our forest in the early 1900s or mid to 1900s, moving on than they even were historically, because they really did well with kind of this harsh treatment. So we saw this really big increase in the forest that we see today on the landscape really came out of um, this era of kind of heavy use followed by land abandonment. So most of our forests now in Illinois and our larger oaks kind of fall into that, 80 to 120-year-old range. Again, came out of this time. And so we see it's just a couple pictures here. We know we have a barge, which is obviously driven a lot by wood, stave mills, iron furnaces, which use charcoal made from wood out there. So a lot of use for wood, especially early on in the late 1800s and early 1900s, drove a lot of that heavy logging. And then we also saw this change in the fire return interval. And this is some of the summaries from Brose's article in 2014 that just looked at changes in pre-European fire return interval to post-European fire return interval. And you can see in most cases there was a big reduction in the fire return interval, which means that, of course, there's more fire putting on the landscape or fire getting on the landscape more frequently. You can see there from 23 to 5 years, from 9 to 4 years, from 6 to 1. So overall, there was quite a bit of more fire getting put on the landscape. Again, once in the 20s, 30s, and into the 40s, we saw this era of kind of reforestation or letting the land go back into forest, kind of Dust Bowl era stuff. And again, oaks thrived in this situation. These environments were promoted oaks over a lot of the other species. And so we see now in Illinois, we have the majority of our upland forests are classified as oak hickory. Right? 68% of the total forest in Illinois currently are kind of classified into that group. And we see that oaks are some of the most abundant trees we have by volume. So white oak is the most volumetrically speaking abundant tree in Illinois, and then black oak and northern red oak are right there in the top four. So we have a lot of big, old oaks. And so we did see this kind of changes over the last 80 or 90 years following this. And these changes are really what led to this regeneration problem we're seeing in oaks on the landscape. Specifically, we went from burning a lot to not burning at all and actually active fire suppression. So we're putting fires out instead of starting them. There was a switch largely driven by people wanting to maintain forest and the views and the aesthetics of forest, a switch from these kind of heavier logging, clear cutting to more selective cutting or single tree where you're retaining a forested canopy in there. And these cutting mechanisms or cutting techniques, sorry, tended to favor more shade tolerant species because it left the forest in a more shaded environment. We saw a drastic increase in deer populations, and we saw the arrival of invasive shrub species on the landscape. So all of these influence oak's ability to regenerate. Of course, regenerate means just developing seedlings, right? So Smokey the Bear on there coming out in the 40s or so. This big push to put out fires, so the establishment of fire towers and active fire suppression across the state did lead to this change in what we call the modern fire return interval. So this is that same study I referenced earlier, where we saw Europeans initially burning the woods more frequently than they had historically been, and then we saw kind of the exact opposite afterwards, where we saw the fire in return interval in modern times being much, much longer. So very, very infrequent fire on the landscape. And we can see sometimes it goes up to 30 years between fires, 60 years between fires. So basically, fire was no longer an active part of our forest. We also saw an explosion of deer on the landscape. So they went from, again, near zero or practically extinct in the state. And somewhere around the 1940s, we saw the population of deer start to skyrocket. You can see in this graph here that by the late 1960s, the deer population was up to about estimated 25,000 in the state. Current population numbers that I could find were a little over 700,000 deer in the state of Illinois. So we really, again, this continued exponential growth of deer until we're at much higher densities nowadays. And that's really important when it's forest because there are a lot of research out there and about how deer can impact oaks and impact forests in general. So the current estimates I could find about deer densities in Illinois by county vary. Right? So some of the counties have a low of around just under 4 deer per square kilometer to some of the higher counties where 13 and a half deer per square kilometer. And so Brose in 2008, his research really showed that you can really start to expect to see big shifts in forest composition, kind of away from oak species when deer densities start to exceed about 14 deer per square kilometer uh, on the landscape when there's high food availability. And so we're talking, crop fields next to forests and things like that. So there's a lot to eat. So it does take quite a bit of deer to start shifting the forest, but you can see we're approaching that. In areas of low deer food availability, such as larger forest blocks, deer densities as low as 5 deer per square kilometer can start seeing these compositional shifts. They're starting to select for other species. And once you get up to around 12 deer per square kilometer, you may actually have complete regeneration failure that the trees just can't regenerate. Everything's getting eaten out there on the landscape. And you can see our numbers are getting close to that. So I'm certain that deer are having a big influence in the regeneration and the development of the forest in the state. If you look at invasive plant species, so especially invasive shrubs tend to be the group that's most problematic into the sustainability of our forest, mainly because they're very, very shade tolerant, they spread easily, and they cast a lot of shade themselves. And so we see situations like this, which is a bush honeysuckle stand in central Illinois, so shaded that there's very little that can even grow underneath of it. And so McCarrigan, in her dissertation, looked at this in Illinois and looked at the phenology of oaks, especially white oak and honeysuckle, and found that the honeysuckle really remained photosynthetically active. So it was green and growing about 57 days longer on average than white oak seedlings. So it just overwhelms them, can get over them and shades them out for a longer period of time. And then McCarrigan also looked at light availability to the forest floor in an area that's invaded with honeysuckle was around 11% of the light available in full sunlight. So really, really effective at shading out the forest floor. So really, really neat research. And you can see that. So this is a picture of some honeysuckle that's bright green and growing in the fall. And if you look above them to the trees are already losing their leaves and thinning. So you can see both the extended leaf phenology and how it's green much later, also just the heavy shade that it casts. And so this is kind of the environment that we're seeing the new forest, less burning, more shaded, higher numbers of deer. And so this does tend to um, encourage or promote more of the shade tolerant species that can handle heavier shade environments. And so we see species like American beech, basswood, sugar maple, doing really, really well in our forest now, and becoming a competitor for our oaks because they have the ability to grow in these moisture, shadier environments. And it's a process we call mesification, where we're transitioning to mesophytes or trees that like more moist, shaded conditions. That's kind of what that term means. And so here's this as an example of a forest that's kind of undergoing this mesification. You can see there's larger oak trees that are the dominant canopy species, which you can see outlined right there. But if you start looking at what else is growing in the mid-story, so this would be younger trees that are developing a mid-story or underneath of the canopy in this particular forest, all of those outlined in red are sugar maple. And so this does several things, but one, the big one, is it casts a ton of shade into our forest floor. And if you see this picture where you have this large towering oak, but all the leaves kind of crowding around it are all sugar maples, it simply creates a situation that's very, very shaded, too shaded really for our oaks seedlings to be able to develop and establish in. Same thing can be said for beech and some of these other very shade tolerant species. And so what we have in these situations over the years, this development of these dense, darker forests, we see things like Day said here, where low light in the understory of our mature forest is one of the limiting factors to the survival and growth of oak reproduction. So shortly after an acorn crop, that results in a bunch of seedlings getting established. Those seedlings just diminish to near extinction because the light levels are below what they can grow in. And that's really kind of the heart of our oak regeneration problem is that it's these forests are very shaded. We're not getting the oaks to establish in. And so we see this even with the data that's out there. And so this is tree seedlings in oak hickory forest. So it's not just across the entire state, it's just in the forest that are classified as oak hickory forest. And we see the oaks and the hickory seedlings are way down the list, and we see a lot more sugar maple, elms, hackberries, ashes, cherries growing as seedlings in an oak hickory forest than we actually do oak and hickory seedlings. And this is starting to translate into a deficit of mature trees. And so what we're seeing, this is really great data from the Forest Inventory and Analysis, which is a long-term data set from the Forest Service. We're seeing trees basically getting dying or getting removed quicker than they're growing. So this is looking at annual net growth of different tree species, which is this column right here that my cursor is in. And the next one is annual mortality and then annual removals. So that would be harvest or removing for some other reason. And if you do the math here for the first one, which is white oak, it's underwater, right? So there's more mortality and more harvest than there is annual growth in white oak. And so we're losing our mature trees faster than new trees can kind of grow in to replace them, right? We just don't have the young stock to replace them. And it's even worse for black oaks and red oaks, which are these next two highlighted. You can see that they are way underwater, where we're losing way more, even to just to mortality than we are net ingrowth. And simply the reason why those are probably more extreme is that the red oaks tend to be a shorter lived species. And so we are reaching kind of that age class, 100 to 120, 130 years old, where we start to see a lot of these red oaks kind of reach natural mortality or start dying, right? So we're seeing a lot more mortality of those naturally due to simply their aging out, whereas the white oaks are much longer lived. If you compare that to other species, so sugar maple, hackberry, and even black walnut, they are net positive. So there's way more annual growth in those species than there are losses. Right? And so you can see this shift happening even in our canopy of our forest over time, um, from a kind of a move away from oaks. And there's been some interesting research in Illinois that highlights this. And uh, one of the best research projects that really demonstrates this mesification and kind of how we're seeing this happen was researched by Jim Zajac and others at SIU, Southern Illinois University, a little while ago. So they looked at this one forest in Hardin County, where they have a data set going all the way back from 1935 to present day. And they have trees marked, trees measured, and they can look at what's growing, what's living, what's dying. And you can see here there's a bunch of different tree species they tracked. And so the ones with the triangles here are sugar maple, and there's all the rest of these. And you can see over time that a lot of these species kind of maintained relative density the same or decreased slightly. But look at sugar maple from 1935 up until I think the last data set was 1997. Just this drastic increase in the relative density of sugar maple in these forests. And these forests really weren't managed. The plots were just there and looked at multiple times. But just really stark change in this increase in sugar maple. And in fact, if you read into their study, they basically said that the recruitment of oaks and hickories on the site has completely failed because no ingrowth survived. And that means basically there's not an oak or hickory tree on the landscape in these plots that was born after 1935. They're all old trees that were in the canopy. There's been no new trees developed um, in the last 70 years on these sites. At the same time, sugar maple has become the most numerous species and the second greatest in basal area over that same period in time. And so they say in the coming decades, without disturbance, it appears likely that sugar maple will become more dominant in the natural areas and at this site, and oak, hickory, and other species will continue to decline and perhaps totally disappear from this protected forest. So really, really just demonstrates the long process of mesification that we're seeing in our forest. And so we see these trends in Illinois, right? So we know that oaks are abundant in the mature canopy of our forest. They're still abundant right now. Oaks make up about 1/3 of the total live tree volume in Illinois. Uh, we see at the same time species like elm, hackberry, and sugar maple becoming the most abundant trees by number of live trees, which means there's a lot of small, young individuals of these species, and they're moving towards kind of becoming the replacement cohort. Most of our oak biomass is in fewer large old trees. Most of the middle-aged and younger trees in Illinois are not oaks, even in oak forest. Our forests are aging. 50% of the forest in Illinois are over 60 years old, and oak mortality is on the rise, particularly in our red oak species. And for all the oaks that were measured on that chart, the removals and mortality, the loss exceeds growth in our oaks. So we're losing volume of trees faster than they're being replaced. And so Crocker wrote about in the Illinois Forest 2015 book, that large numbers of mature oak dominate the overstory. There is little oak regeneration in the understory. As oaks senesce, mortality will create canopy gaps that will most likely be filled by maples and elms, which now occupy the understory in large numbers. So that's kind of setting the stage of where we're at. That's explaining kind of the situation on the ground. And so we see this regeneration bottleneck. And so it really is in this idea of advanced seedlings. We still have plenty of acorns. And in fact, currently, according to Day in 2013, oak forest in the eastern US are at their peak capacity to produce acorns. So we have lots of acorn production. We actually have lots of seedling production, seedling establishment. The density of oak seedlings and sprouts may be really high on the landscape. What we don't have is what's called advanced seedlings. So an advanced seedling is just an oak seedling that's has enough light, have enough space to grow beyond just a tiny little seedling up into a 2.5, 3 foot tall seedling that's have it's uh, large enough in diameter and really well established. That's the bottleneck. That's the class that we're missing on the landscape is this advanced seedlings. And so when we're looking at regenerating oaks, there's a bit of a balance. We know just from what we talked about, too little light in our forest leads to sugar maples, basswoods, and beech simply because oaks can't grow and you get these shade tolerant species. But on the flip side, too much light, oaks can grow and tend to grow well, but they're often overwhelmed by faster growing shade intolerant species. So tulip poplar, sweet gum, black cherry, even hickories in some case, and a lot of our invasive species. So we do have this balance where oaks are right in the middle of that intermediate shade tolerance. And on either side of those, other species tend to win out. Now, I mentioned earlier about productive sites, and so I will say that this is very, very different depending on where you're at on the landscape. And so lower productivity sites, so sites that are drier or have thinner soils or less organic soils where trees don't grow as fast, your window or your capacity to get oak regeneration is very wide. A lot of times you don't have to do anything and oaks are going to regenerate in these sites, right? So this big window and it's much easier to get oak regeneration in those simply because the the habitat, the conditions on the ground are not as favorable for either the mesophytic species or even those fast growing species, right? Oaks kind of it works well for oaks. And you see that on the landscape in some of these sites that are rockier or drier. You can often go in and see just an abundance of oak regeneration. Now, as you drift into more productive sites, so sites that have better soils, better growing conditions, the competing species, both the shade tolerant and the shade intolerant species, do really well. And so your window that's most favorable for oak tends to be much narrower than you're going to get that oak really is the favored species. And so again, in darker situations, too little light, you tend to get sugar maple and other species like you see here. In wide open conditions, you get these fast growing species, whether they're sycamore, tulip tree, some of these other things. And so when you're looking at promoting oak regeneration, site productivity really matters. So here's a quote from Day again. On more xeric sites, so drier sites, of average or lower site quality, oaks have a better chance of rising to dominance in maturing stands, even without silvicultural intervention. They have a good chance of doing it on their own. On higher quality sites or more productive sites, when competing with vigorous growing species such as yellow poplar, oaks can be suppressed and diminish in the stand. So that's one of the things that we have to think about when we're looking at managing for oak regeneration is this a poor site, an intermediate site, or a very productive site? So let's look at the practices that are used to promote oak regeneration. So I'm going to talk about a couple here, particularly mid-story thinning, the use of prescribed fire, little tiny bit about invasive species control, and then overstory removals or timber harvest, and then combination of multiple treatments. All of these things are often recommended as to be put on the ground to help oaks. Let's talk first about thinning. And so one of the common things you hear in Illinois is TSI or FSI, which stands for timber stand improvement, forest stand improvement. Usually those terms are used basically to mean a mid-story reduction or a mid-story removal. And so it's removing competing less desirable tree species out of that mid-story to get better light conditions to the understory. So the studies on how effective thinning are really vary a lot. It depends on the timing and the intensity of thinning, whether you're going to do follow-up treatments or combine it with other treatments, and especially those site conditions before thinning, whether that's how productive the site is or whether there are oaks on the ground already, a regeneration on the ground already or not. So just kind of in general, as a standalone treatment, thinning is often not sufficient alone to produce oak regeneration in intermediate or productive sites, right? You need some other kind of treatment in there to help to control those competing tree species. That could be an overstory removal to get more light in, or it could be something like the addition of fire. And so there's some studies out there that kind of show this and have looked at it. So one study here from Hutchinson, they looked at thinning with herbicides, so chemical thinning, so they were just killing the trees, and then followed that a few years later with a timber harvest. And so they found that the fact that the site was thinned ahead of time really didn't make any difference to the density and the mix of tree seedlings that were on the ground. They kind of had them all in the same quantities, both control and the thin sites. And then they went on to look at the dominance here. So same thing, there was very little change in oak dominance. So they still had competitors um, on all the sites, whether they were not thinned or thinned ahead of time, right? So in that instance, thinning didn't really have a big influence. Another study by Parrott and others found that the thinning really did increase seedling diameter and height for oaks. And so they did a thinning in an area. They looked at it after 5 growing seasons. They came back and they found that the survival of oak seedlings, the diameter growth of oak seedlings, and the height growth of oak seedlings were all higher in areas that they've thinned versus areas that were not thinned ahead of time. So that does show that there was quite a bit of benefit in to the seedlings on the ground from the thinning. And then Hackworth kind of followed this up even years later. And so these were 9 years after thinning, and they had a harvest 6 years previous to, and they found that yeah, oaks seedlings were taller 9 years when you thinned the area. But the problem was that there was a lot of other competitors in there, and particularly yellow poplar and red maple in this case, um, really did also grow well. And so what you found is that they didn't improve their competitive status in there because of all these other competing species. So yes, they did grow tall, but there still was a lot of competition going on. And so we see this in other studies too, where oaks respond to thinning, but those competing species do as well. So there's a couple studies. The first one found that you did see higher heights and higher diameters of our oak seedlings, but the tulip poplar and other species as well exceeded that of the oak, so they grew even more. And Craig in his study found oak seedling heights and diameters were also greater when you removed things through thinning, but it didn't increase their competitiveness because it released all the species out there, all the other tree species. And so if you look at thinning itself just as a practice and doing nothing else, there are some limitations to that. And this is a really good document that I'm highlighting, Lotka in 2023, which was a kind of a recommendations document on the use of thinning, and it was written for the White Oak Initiative. So Lotka writes in here, the lack of naturally developed reproduction, advanced reproduction, tall trees at the time of the treatment um, can significantly limit the effectiveness of this practice. So he was saying basically, um, if you don't have some oaks on the ground, this practice is might be more limiting. It's really releasing oaks that are already kind of in place more so than establishing new. So he said, conducting this practice in hopes of establishing seedlings after the thinning is a risk. The practice can encourage the growth of shade tolerant and in shade tolerant competitors, and oak seedlings, if you have to wait a year or two for them to establish, they may suffer simply because you're releasing all these other tree species, right? So thinning is best done when you have seedlings on the ground that can really react to the release more so than thinning, hoping to get new oak seedlings. And so in the same document, their recommendations were low productivity sites. They tend to take care of themselves and they may not even need to be thinned. But if they do, a thinning can be very effective. But really, the practice is most warranted on medium and high productivity sites where you have a lot of mid-story that you want to remove and you have some oak regeneration already on the ground. So you're removing that mid-story and releasing the reproduction that's already on the ground. That's the best use for thinning as a practice. And so they end with mid-story removal or thinning is recommended for mature oak dominated forest. It's an intermediate treatment, but it should make sense in combination with some level of canopy removal to fully release these species. All right, moving on to prescribed fire. So prescribed fire is something that is really caught on a lot as a tool to help with oaks. There's a ton of research. I found more research on prescribed fire than any of the other techniques out there. And we know that fire does have the ability to reduce competition, remove leaf litter, increase light, improve seed bed conditions for germinating acorns. So there can certainly be a lot of benefits from prescribed fire. In general, a single fire really has little long-term benefit to oak regeneration. You don't see a lot of that moving the needle much. It really takes multiple fires, and we have seen a lot of research where multiple fires can be very beneficial to oak regeneration, especially if you combine it with other treatment types. It is worth noting that fire will generally top kill oak seedlings. So even though they survive, they're typically killed down to the ground and have to come back through sprouting. So if you do eventually want to get oaks moving into a larger canopy position or moving in there ready to go into the canopy, you're going to have a fire-free interval to allow those oaks to grow into a stage that's fire resistant. And that interval may be 10 to 30 years, depending on the site, before those oaks are big enough to withstand fire. So know that just a continual use of fire, even every few years, can certainly get more oak seedlings on the ground or get more oak sprouts on the ground, but it's not going to be enough to get those trees up into the canopy. They're going to have to be removed from fire for a little while before they can do that. And it's also good to note that oak seedlings sprout at a higher rate than mesophytic species. So again, repeated fires is a good way to thin out some of those other species. And fire alone, generally in a very productive site, um, will not generally create enough light to promote oak regeneration. If there's a real well-developed mid-story, it's going to take either repeated hot fires or some other practice like thinning. And so this Day and Hartman research showed that oak seedlings can survive multiple fires fairly easily, even at a small size. And so the bottom axis here is the diameter of the seedling, and even at very, very small diameters, we see white oaks, close to 90% survival with one burn and over 60% survival of these small seedlings with 3 or 4 burns. And as that seedling increases in diameter, its survivorship increases. And the same for black oak, if they increase near to 100% survival even after multiple burns. And we don't see the same thing with other species. And I'll just note black gum here, one burn, it's 90 plus percent survival. And then it's way down there around 15% survival after multiple burns, right? And so we definitely see certain tree species just not surviving multiple burns where oaks tend to survive it well. Again, they survive well, but they often die to the ground and have to sprout back. So this is a really interesting study here. So on the left is 4 years after one burn, and these are oak seedlings. And on the right is 1 year after 4 burns. And so you can see the black is pre-burn height. Both cases, we had this distribution all the way up to 6 meters tall in height after before the burn, and then 4 years after one burn, all these seedlings are down here in 1 meter or 2 meter, right? So it did knock them all the way back. While they survived, they are much shorter. And then 1 year after 4 burns, we see this even more extreme, where we have this distribution of heights across all the way from 1 to 6 meters. And then after 4 burns, while most of them are still alive, they're all in that smaller class, right? They're all surviving through sprouting. And so it takes a surprisingly big tree, even with an oak, to survive the top part of it, to keep from being top killed. So Winston found that an oak seedling or sapling has about a 50% chance of not being top killed in a prescribed fire when it reaches a basal diameter, so the diameter at the base of the ground of about 2.5 inches. So a 2.5 inch oak is basically a coin flip, whether that's going to be top killed or not in a fire. And that number approaches 100% survival. So it's almost guaranteed to survive a fire when that same tree gets up to a little over 4 inches in diameter. So that's the period that you would need to wait. You'd have a fire-free period to allow those oaks to kind of get up to that 4 inch diameter size, so that they're going to be much, much more likely to survive a fire and not be top killed. And so again, there's just a lot of research out there looking at burning. And so there's a couple things here, burned seedlings and burned saplings of maple, tulip tree or yellow poplar, and oaks. And basically on the left is like the number of stems, the density of the stems, burned and unburned. And you can see it knocks back the oak, it knocks back everything. The fire certainly knocks back things, all species. But where you see the benefit to oak is that it doesn't get knocked back as much as the others. So while you still see a reduction in the density of seedlings right after a burn, they are often in a better competitive situation. So on the right is the relative density. And so you can see the burned, which is the black and the hatched for the oaks. The density of those, the relative density is much higher. Even though the actual number of stems are lower, there's more oaks surviving than everything else. So it puts them in a better competitive environment after a burn. And the same thing, it really depends on the site conditions as well. So we find in dry plots, this is pretty interesting. I see. So this is a study that looked at repeated burns, 3 or 4 burns over a 13-year period. And you can see on the left here, these are a unburned dry plot. So the top is that top left. And you can see unburned, the oaks are present, but they don't really move at all. They kind of stay at a low number. But in the unburned mesic plots, so the plots that are higher productivity, there's basically no oak seedlings. They're way at the bottom, right? They just don't make it there over the whole time. Once you add fire to a dry plot, everything kind of gets knocked back, oaks and the mesophytic species for the first few burns. And then when there's a bit of a burn-free period, you see that there's a recovery and you do see some oaks on the landscape, but you also see a recovery of some of those mesophytic species. In a mesic plot or a highly more productive plot, you see that multiple fires knock things back, but you don't really see a lot of the oak recovery just because it wasn't there in the first place. And so this study looked at that and said that oak hickory advanced regeneration was more abundant on burn plots, that other methods such as herbicide or cutting, thinning are necessary to further to stay in density and develop oaks, especially on the mesic sites. And there was one really neat study that looked at this at a long period. So this was about a 20-year period where they looked at burning and they looked at burning and thinning and how it influenced the oaks and the other species over time. And so they found that after 2 decades, 4 fires over that 20-year period substantially reduced and sustained lower densities of these mesophytic species in the mid-story and sapling layer, and then limited their probability that they're going to fill in those canopy gaps. So it really put them at a low level. And this was particularly important in intermediate or dry sites that they found that the fires increased large oak hickory regeneration over the period. Right. So they set it up. Now, if you didn't burn at all, it basically on dry and mesic sites, low and high productive sites, without burning in these situations, even with thinning, it was kind of all moving towards the mesophytic species, the maples and things. And so pretty a lot of graph here, a lot of information, but look at the center bottom, the one that says oak hickory large regeneration. So these graphs are a moisture index. So on the left by the 20 is the drier sites. And as you go up to the 80 on the right, that's the more productive sites. And you can see that the fire and the mechanical thinning plus fire on the drier sites, you see a really, really big increase in oak and hickory regeneration being developed, right? Especially compared to all the other just control and just thinning alone. It really did a good job of building up a lot of regeneration on the dry sites. But as you move towards the more productive sites, you see that there really isn't a lot of difference, right? And so this technique worked really, really well on the dry sites, and then it was less effective on the more productive sites. It's still pretty interesting. And then the last thing on fire here, another site study that looked at repeated burns. So they found that there was burned 3 or 4 times over about an 18-year period, that it reduced the number of maple seedlings and improved oak seedlings. There were still surviving red maples and they were still competitive. And so this results supports an increased use of other silvicultural treatments. So they said fire alone is a good start, but you would probably want to use thinning or some other technique in addition to kind of fully achieve, oaks being in a competitive status. Right. So that's fire, a ton of information. And I can see already I'm way running out of time. This is going to end up being way long, so I'll burn through some of this stuff. Just one quick study here on deer. That deer, excluding deer, can be very, very beneficial to the growth of seedlings. So either excluding them or reducing the deer population through control techniques, harvest can be very effective at helping the seedlings grow. Let's talk a little bit about timber harvest here. So one of the things that has been used a lot is clear cuts, saying that clear cuts or patch cuts has been effective. It can be effective at lower productivity sites, but on those higher productivity sites, usually there's a lot more competition from fast-growing species, and so you tend not to have that be a successful treatment. There has been some studies that looked at strip clear cuttings, so it's not a full clear cut, but it's creating a matrix of open and closed or intact forest. Seem to be a little bit better, particularly in this case for red oaks. In the intact forest, the seedlings grew really well, but in the open areas, you still had a lot of competition. Kind of one of the things that's being used a lot more now is this thing called a shelter wood cut, which is a series of partial cuts that slowly opens the forest up over time to create better light conditions for oak to grow. Um, and then you often combine that with fire and understory thinning. And so this has proven to be one of the better techniques for harvest that promotes oak over time. And the keys to success in shelter wood cut would be making sure to include that understory and mid-story vegetation control, and especially as you cut trees, controlling those stump sprouts with herbicides so that you're not getting sprouts from the undesirable species after the harvest. One shelter wood has failed. It's been no control of competing vegetation, not leaving enough overstory oaks to basically develop oak regeneration, or too many deer on the landscape. And there's been a few studies out there that's looked at things. So Saunders and Gaffney found that the oaks certainly grow best in the open parts of a shelterwood cut, but so do the others, right? So they suggest mid-story control, competition control, can be something that really is needed when you get in the gaps where the oaks do want to grow. And so there's been a lot of work on this. I won't dwell on this one. It basically says the same thing. Oaks grew best in the open areas, but so did other species as well, particularly yellow poplar in this study. And so, understanding that, they went on to say that a reduction in competitors may require direct silvicultural intervention to improve reproductive success. So just doing a shelter wood cut and doing nothing else wasn't effective. They recommended doing some other kind of intervention, and one of the ones that's often used is fire, right? So fire added to a shelterwood system has had a lot of promising results for helping to regenerate oak, particularly because it is thinning out some of those competing species that are less tolerant to fire, even though it may take a while. This process may take 10 to 20 or more years to develop really good oak reproduction in a shelterwood system. I'll move over this, but just know that white oak and red oak did well in when you added burns to a shelterwood. Mesophytic species did worse when you added burns, but you also tended to release things like sumac and sassafras with a fire. And so overall, fire is something that can be added to a shelterwood system, but you need to be careful if you put it in too soon after your first cut, because you can actually impact those young oak seedlings before they're big enough to start to withstand the fire and be able to sprout. So one recommendation was 4 to 7 years or so. You should wait before putting a fire in after a shelterwood cut. Somebody else Winston looked at it in a drier site and said that can maybe need to be 10 years or more because the oaks are just growing a little slower. And in that same study, he found that when you did burn in a shelterwood, you had over 200% more regeneration of white oak, 87% more regeneration of red oak. You had a little bit more black cherry, but maple regeneration was 90% lower. So it really did have this big influence of uh, of improving the situation for the seedlings. So we've talked about the different techniques. We talked about, especially with shelterwood, kind of putting things together, like combining it. So let's kind of put this all together in the last couple minutes. I'm happy to stay later if people have questions too. But just kind of in review, we know that the amount of effort needed to obtain adequate oak regeneration increases with site productivity. And oftentimes, those more productive sites, you're going to have to combine techniques, overstory removal, fire, and thinning to get really good results. And it's going to take time, sometimes a decade or more. So we know it requires light to the forest understory, and that promotes fast-growing competitors. So that's why the addition of fire is almost always a needed addition when you're looking at trying to get oak regeneration. But timing is important. Waiting until you have a good flush of oak seedlings on the ground, even if they're small, is important before opening the canopy. So it allows them to react and be able to respond to that opening instead of letting everything else respond first and them trying to play catch up afterwards. And so there's kind of consistent across all these research studies that I looked at, combinations of treatments performed best. Thinning accompanied by fire, overstory removal with the addition of fire, thinning as well, really tended to be consistently the best practices, especially on the more productive sites to yield oak regeneration. And we see that there's the last couple studies. This is a Southern Indiana study that found that following the burn in this site, they did a shelter wood and a thinning and a burn. So they combined everything. Oak seedlings had greater survival and sprouting than all the other competing species. In fact, it said white oak doubled in seedling density after the burning and was one of the most abundant species in that environment. This other study by Taylor again found that the combination of mechanical thinning and fire was the best at reducing the basal area and opening up light and getting more saplings on the ground. You can see on this top. And if you look at what those saplings were, they were largely oaks, right? And so again, the kind of combination of mechanical thinning and fire over a 17-year period, and this was repeated fires, really was the best technique to get oaks on the ground. All right, then the last study I'll just mention was this long-term study that looked at thinning and burning. So they have control, thin only, burn only, and thin and burn. And so this was repeated burnings over about a 20-year period, and the combined burning and thinning treatment was the most effective, with average sapling densities increasing by over 2,000% for oak and 1,000% for hickories. This one also looked at American chestnut and it also responded really well. So, kind of in summary, we know that there's a lack of adequate oak regeneration, and it's a common issue across Illinois forest, particularly in intermediate or more productive sites. If all you're doing is a single thinning or doing an occasional prescribed fire, you're unlikely really to result in any significant increases in oak regeneration. Especially on those productive sites, you usually have to do some level of canopy removal and combine that with thinning or fire or both. And then if you are using fire, you're going to have some level of a fire-free period, maybe 10 years or more, to allow those oaks to grow up into that 4-inch basal diameter size or larger so that they can start surviving fire before you bring fire back onto the landscape. I know there's a ton of information. I know I went a little long, but it's hard to kind of hit everything, and I only kind of scratched the surface. If you're interested in just learning more about our oaks in general, not the management, but just the ID and the biology of them, I'll leave this up here, which is a workshop we did a couple years ago on the different oaks of Illinois. And so that talks about 21 different oak species. If you really want to dive into oaks, I would recommend watching that.